So first, let me thank the UNE and the other organizers for putting together this school. I've been following the first classes. It is very interesting and challenging at the time because, as you will realize, you have already realized with the other lectures and with this one, it's a very complicated topic to discuss. So first, obviously, when I accepted the invitation, I was looking forward to be in Banyuls. I've been there in Banyuls once, and I really enjoy the place. And I hoped we had been there, but obviously we are not. And it's making probably the school even more difficult to organize because it's hard to speak to students across a screen. But let's go for it. Uh, I think when I prepared this lecture, I went back to all publications, and one scientist from whom I learned a lot about multi-phase ASM is Don Cox. He was one of the pioneers, and he wrote before I think retiring. He wrote this review in 2005, which I really invite you to look at, and he had some conclusion about this and saying basically it's kind of a disclaimer of what you can achieve as a scientist working on the interstellar medium. You have to be very modest because the observation that are awesome, as they are very diverse, they provide very deep perspective. But at the end, when you try to put things together, we are very far from having a comprehensive view, as the data is fragmentary. It's very difficult to interpret. We will need a model to interpret it, but at the end, we don't have really a model because the ISM physics is far too intricate and too complex to be worked out in any approximation within some analytical framework. So I think his view at that time was basically, and it was before I think there were the big development of numerical simulations, and that the what he calls the grand synthesizers will be a machine, and I think we are coming to this where computers are helping us to visualize what we observe, but we have to be careful with this because obviously, as he already said it before, as the machines are very powerful, but at the same time they are anyway very far from being close to reality in the number of scales and physical process they take into account. So a lot of the intricate physics which I will discuss tends to be even in the highest resolution of simulations and tends to be subgrid physics, subgrid modeling or just ignored. And as I'll try to explain, you never know when you make such an approximation to what extent you don't really bias your results. So it is the forward I wanted to say before I even start presenting anything. So it's obviously, as you have seen already from the previous speakers and my introduction, it's a very complex field. So in 90 minutes, you can only touch on some subjects, and obviously it takes a lot of time to even get into any one of those subjects as a student. So it was hard to summarize and decide what to talk about because there is so much. But so I am an observer, but I like to have an overall understanding of what I'm observing, and so I decided to start with a more like simple but theoretical view, which I call the overall picture. And once you have that in hand, I will give you a tour of interstellar observations, just sampling a few perspectives. And after these two sections, maybe we can have a break for questions, and then I will go into two specific topics where I will detail a bit more what are the outstanding questions we face and what observations tells us about it. So these are my four topics, and we'll have a break in the middle. So let's first go to this the main point of my talk is to describe the structure and energetics of the multiphase ISM. So this is not completely new from you, because I think all of the previous lecturers have already addressed this to some extent. The perspective I will take is far more detailed, because I will start. It will be based on galactic observations, which provide by far the groundwork and it was the first view at the multiphase ISM. It also still by far the more detailed. So the big picture, it starts within a galaxy, as those are the numbers for the Milky Way, but you could update the same picture will apply to other galaxies with different numbers. So you have in the stellar medium in the galaxy, you have about 5 billion solar masses of matter, which is about 10% of the stellar mass, and it is the mass which is available to form new stars, and it's continuously renewed by the outflow of older stars and probably some inflow, although this is very difficult to identify in the observations. At that time, as this slide is borrowed from a lecture by Paul van der Werf, at that time it was not clear that there was a galactic wind, but now I think there is evidence that there is near the galactic center, there is some outflow in our galaxy. And so you have to keep in mind that the interstellar medium in a galaxy is an open system. It receives matter from outside, and it loses matter from outside. This is an important fact. So this matter, as we know, is forming a few solar masses of new stars per year. It's very inefficient in forming stars, and this is one of the outstanding questions for a long time, to understand why this efficiency is so low. And so the other input is what we call the stellar ejecta, which are important in the history of a galaxy, because they come with new metals, with dust, and it basically contributes to change with time of the composition of the interstellar matter. And some of this matter is lost for a long time. Everything which goes in white dwarf, neutron stars, black holes, basically decouples from this lively exchange and stays within the galaxy. So let's jump right away in what we call the interstellar medium phases. I think the frontier between those phases is ill-defined, but the first thing you have to keep in mind is that there is a huge range of temperatures and densities, and basically there are some kind of frontiers which are being set, and to be able to give names to some of the for the interpretation of the observation. So the galaxy, and I show evidence for this, it's filled with hot plasma, at least 1 million degrees. So there is evidence for even much hotter gas. And this gas is thought to be produced by fast shocks. And this is the only way we understand its existence. It has a very long cooling time. If you let it sit like this, it will, unlike the others, it will stay there for a long time. There is another component which is quite widespread, this warm ionized gas, which shows that there is probably presence of Lyman continued photons, even very far from star-forming regions. So the idea is that the photons are able to percolate through a clumpy interstellar medium to large distances. In addition to this warm ionized medium, there is also a warm neutral medium, where the frontier between the two might be ill-defined, because the ionization fraction of the warm neutral medium may often be quite high. And there is another component which is called the cold neutral medium, which is and I will explain that there is a clear division between those two in terms of equilibrium temperature. And obviously, so this cold neutral medium, it starts to be temperatures which is much denser because it's only at a few 100 Kelvin, and all of these phases tend to be on average in pressure equilibrium, and this cold medium is a step towards molecular gas. And molecular gas is of particular interest because this is from observation, this is, we know, the place where stars form. So it's really we'll say the active part of the ISM, as the molecular clouds are giving birth to the stars, and the others are basically the reservoir of matter and energy which controls the energetics. So this is a bit the way one can see these different phases. So again, here, for an example of to really put to be more specific about these phases, I used a numerical simulation, and so you see with the different colors and this cold, warm, ionized, and hot phases, you see that they are distributed in scale height above the disk of the galaxy in a different ways, and the cold matter is condensed towards the equatorial midplane, and the others are much more widespread, but that most of the mass actually is not in this cold neutral medium. It is in the warm phases, and if you look at the energy, although the hot phase here accounts for very little fraction of the mass, you see that it is a dominant reservoir of energy when you go to these heights above the galactic plane. And so you basically all of these components, they matter for different reasons, and this is this multi-phase structure, as you will see in the observation, is universal, and we find it across the universe, across galaxy evolution. It was discovered in the Milky Way, but it is of general relevance. So these phases, they are not really, so you should not think about them as being isolated entities. We are really talking here about a dynamical network. Everything is connected through multiple processes, and basically matters flows in and out of these phases, and in ways we would like to understand. And so this is again a flow diagram from Paul van der Werf, and you see all of the physical processes, which I'm not going to detail, which connect all of these phases. You have to realize here that any of these arrows here, any of these processes is a research topic by itself, with many publications, many models. There is a lot of knowledge which has been acquired on interstellar medium, and which we, in a way, in a presentation like this, and more generally, we would like to gloss out, because it seems hopeless to be able to describe all of these processes happening in interstellar space. What we really would like to understand is how this whole thing works. So it's basically, you have this dynamical network of ISM phases, and we would like globally to understand the big picture, and this is really the big challenge. So one of the big ideas which has arisen in the comparison of observations and simulation is that it is this multi-phase nature of the ISM which is regulating star formation. That you basically the multi-phase ISM, it would like to cool, you dissipate its energy, and gravity then will take over, and you form these giant molecular clouds, which are seen in the observations, star forming cores, and you form stars. And the star formation eventually there will be supernova remnants, stellar winds, stellar radiation, and it's all combines to galaxy dynamics to provide some kind of feedback. And so you basically, like in many natural systems, there is a feedback loop where the objects you have formed basically re-inject part of their matter, but mostly their energy into the system. And this feedback loop is so to control the star formation rate. This is really And you see that in this, as what is really important is now is not so much a mass flow, but it is really the energetics. How does this feedback couples to the multi-phase ISM, and where does the energy goes? Because depending on where it goes, the path to dissipation and the way the medium will be able to cool change. So this is really the difficulty, is to understand these two arrows is where we know how much energy goes out through feedback, but we don't really know and understand how it is distributed across the multi-phase ISM and in terms of thermal and mechanical energy. And we would like then to know, because it's going to change, how it quickly going to dissipate and allow gravity to form new stars. And this balance, which we are trying to capture with numerical simulations, is going to regulate the star formation, and in a way, and subsequently galaxy evolution. So the flow of energy is described a bit like this, with the processes which are important. Basically, you always have this open system where you have an outflow and inflow matter, which contribute to bulk flows. As the bulk flow can be created by the galaxy dynamics, including those outflow and accretion flow, but also more locally by supernovae and winds. And those bulk flows tend to be rather high velocity, so they will create shocks, and the shocks will part of the energy in the shock will go into magnetic energy, cosmic rays, but also in the gas thermal energy. And this is a path for the energy. But there is definitely another path, which we have learned to really learn its importance. Is that basically the kinetic energy which is in bulk flow is going to cascade to smaller scales and across the ISM phases in turbulent motions, and this may be mediated in part by the thermal instability. And at the end, what we see is that the cold and warm phases are turbulent, as the turbulence, so kind of random motions are supersonic in the cool medium, as they are more transonic in the warm phases, and they can then they can be dissipated, because the turbulence itself can create shocks and convert this energy into magnetic energy, cosmic rays, or thermal energy, and those go out. And this system is open to outside, also through the fact that it's going to radiate. And so the gas thermal energy is going to lead to radiation, and the magnetic fields and the cosmic ray, they are not held forever in the galaxy, as they tend to diffuse out and magnetize the intergalactic medium. So you have an exit for these two reservoirs of energy. And so one of the big questions is, again, through the observations and coupled to numerical simulation, is to understand these energetic flows, because this is what's going to control the efficiency of star formation. So a bit more about, now I'm focusing a bit more on the phases. As I told you before, as a hot ionized medium is produced by shocks, and it has to be very fast shocks. This is the post-shock temperature as a function of shock velocity, and you see that to produce 1,000,000-degree gas, you need a shock velocity at least of 200-300 kilometers by second. And but such shocks exist, in particular from supernova remnant, and this is assumed to be the main source of hot gas in a galaxy like ours. But obviously, in other galaxies, there are other sources of hot gas, the AGN feedback, the galaxy collisions, and accretion. The massive accretion of intergalactic gas can create such shocks at such velocities. So the cooling of this gas is presented here. It's an illustration of the coupling of the ISM physics with detailed calculation of microphysics, because when you have a cooling curve like this, you see it's a combination of the emission from different ions here, which are marked here, helium, hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, as the most abundant elements in the ISM. Thus, it depends on metallicity, and there is a contribution also from hot electrons. And when you want really to integrate this, and this is a simple calculation where the abundances of these ions are assumed to be at equilibrium. But in practice, if you really want to model correctly the hot ionized medium, you have to take into account that the ionization timescales are comparable to the cooling timescales, and you are often out of equilibrium. And then it depends how it's cool, if it is isobaric, isochoric. So you have different assumptions. And for example, very few numerical simulations will take this into account, the detailed ionization state of the plasma, because it's far too heavy to do this at the same time than the galaxy dynamics and the ISM dynamics. So the same coupling between our understanding of the observation and the microphysics processes is present to understand the existence of the cold neutral medium and warm neutral medium. And what we observe is supposed to be more or less at equilibrium. At least this is it should be on average something true, as that we are close to equilibrium. And so you can compute as the heating, the equilibrium you expect from known heating and cooling processes. And this is something which has been done for some time. And one of the reference here is this paper by Mark Wolfire. And you see the different processes which in dashed is a cool heating processes, which it is the interaction of the gas with here the dust with UV light, the gas with X-ray and cosmic rays, and all of these interactions with ionizing radiation produce electrons which are superthermal, and this energy is given to the gas, and those are the main known heating processes, and you basically do your macrophysics calculations to understand how it's going to be balanced by the cooling lines, and these cooling lines are important because these are they directly connect to photons which we can observe with our telescope. So it's something we have access directly from to observations, unlike the heating processes. And the cooling radiation comes towards us, and we can observe it with our telescopes. And you see the different here again, ions from carbon, oxygen dominate. Here, Lyman alpha from hydrogen dominate the cooling. So the cooling, because it results from the collision of two particles in the gas, it tends to be proportional to the density square, while the heating, since it is the interaction of a photon with or a cosmic ray with atoms, it's proportional to the gas density. So you see right away here that the denser the gas, the cooler it will be, because lambda goes to as n square, and gamma, which is the heating rate, goes as n. So this is going naturally to lead to this separation between cold and warm phases. So if you look, this is a diagram where you have the pressure and the density of the medium, and this gray curve here is the loci of the equilibrium values, and where there is equilibrium between the cooling and heating, and you see that there are it divides this diagram in two regions. And if you are above this line, you have net cooling, so the gas is not stable and it's going to cool until it reaches equilibrium. And if it's below, it's heating dominates, and it's going to heat until you reach you reach the equilibrium. And there are in this diagram, so along the equilibrium, there are two stable phases. If you the regions which are here are known to be unstable. So if they are perturbed, they don't go back to the equilibrium curve. While in this region, so the equilibrium is stable. If there is any perturbation, you will go back to equilibrium. So this was known for a long time, already in the 60s. George Field predicted this, and that there will be 2 phases, and it was concomitant with the first observation of atomic hydrogen, which confirmed this view. So this curve of equilibrium depends on the microphysics, and it depends on the local physical conditions and the metallicity, the dust abundance, but also the obviously the UV radiation field. So it's already something which is going to contribute to regulate star formation, because basically to form stars, you would like to form cold gas, because this cold gas is going to be the step towards gravitationally bound molecular clouds, which can form stars. But if your pressure here is too low, you don't have any cold gas. But if the pressure is too low, this curve is going to go down, because the UV radiation field, you have less young stars, so you have less radiation field, and the curve goes down. Is what you see here in the outer galaxy. This curve is below the minimum pressure you need to get a cold neutral medium. Above this value here is below what you find in the inner galaxy, where the UV radiation field is high. So you see already an example, and it's not the only one, where the system is going to be to self-regulate. If you want to form stars, for that you need to have cold gas, but you can quench the formation of cold gas. In some galactic environments, it's probably quenched, but often it's robust, so that it will, if the radiation field is low, it will be easier to form cold gas, and then you can restart star formation, and there is a concrete example of a feedback loop. So one thing which I put these numbers because it's important to capture the fact that the equilibrium is nice, because it allows you to do simple calculation, but it's a simplification. As the time scales which are involved, in particular in this thermal balance, are very short for some of the phases, and much shorter than the dynamical time scales associated with turbulence. And basically the medium is not going to be able to reach equilibrium. Equilibrium will be always something the medium will like to tend towards, but it's not always able to do so, because the local physical conditions are going to be modified by the gas dynamics on time scales which are much shorter. And this is so you see that the time scales are very short for the cold neutral medium, and so these gas tend to be able to adapt to the local dynamical time scale, but it's not the case for the warm phases and the hot phases, which have very long time to reach thermal equilibrium. So most of the time the local physical conditions are going to change on time scales which are much shorter than this. And so basically the gas will be observed out of equilibrium. This is something you have to have in mind. So in practice, this is captured by numerical simulations. In here you see, again, the same simulation by Xianggu Kim and Ivo Striker. Ivo Striker will give a lecture next week, which should be very interesting. And you see in a simulation now, which more or less includes all of the physics I have just described. Now you have the distribution of the matter in terms of this is a fraction of the color is a fraction of the gas as a function of this is a fraction of the mass, and this is a fraction of the volume. So you see it here. This dashed line corresponds to a temperature of 1.2 million degrees, and this is more or less the temperature of the hot plasma in the solar neighborhood. It shows that this gas accounts for a little fraction of the mass, but a large fraction of the volume. In this simulation, most of the volume is occupied by this hot medium. But if you look at the mass, most of the mass is here in the warm phase. And what you can see here is that I remember I told you that the middle the middle branch of this equilibrium curve wasn't stable, but as you see, there is a lot of matter at these intermediate temperatures, just because what I just said, the dynamical timescales are shorter than the cooling timescales, and this allows for this gas to be here. It's on its way towards one of the stable branches. And the other things I would like you to see in this diagram is that you have a huge range of pressure, and in the idealized description of the ISM, when one talks about pressure equilibrium at one given pressure, but you see here that the range of pressures in these simulations are very large. So to finish this overall introduction I went back to the review paper of Don Cox and took this picture, which was his what he called his conceptions of the interstellar medium on different scales. And this is what he could see of possible scenarios within the near the galactic plane. How the different phases might be distributed, and so the colors here show the different phases I just introduced, and in a way all of these scenarios are possible, and none of them are excluded, and probably there are galaxies I'm sure there are galaxies in the objects we know and we observe, which will for which any of these pictures will apply. And this last picture, it introduces one component we don't really know how to deal with, which I will discuss towards the end, is the magnetic field. But let the other ones tell you, for example, here how what is the volume, the fraction of volume which is filled with hot gas. Here it is all of it. Here it's localized. Here it's more confined to some specific environments, and here it is into one specific super bubble created by one specific clustered star formation, big star formation region. And all of these questions comes in. We would like to understand how these different phases are interconnected, especially in space. And this is not only near the galactic plane where star formation happens, but it also connects to the disk halo structure, and how the phases are distributed, and what are the flows which are being created in and out the thin star forming disk, where you could have a gas which is escaping. You could have a galactic fontaine which is widespread, or galactic fontaine which is confined to some specific super bubbles, or you could have some global equilibrium over a 6 disk. And I think this is the picture for a galaxy like the Milky Way I will favor, or something where the disk is very directly connected to the galactic halo. And so this you can look at this on a even larger scale. It's up to the virial radius, and all of the matter which is in the galaxy is confined within a dark matter halo, which holds things together. You need a lot of energy for matter to go out of the dark matter halo. This is possible, but probably it may not happen that often. Most galaxies tend to keep the gas they were formed with. But obviously it's going to be distributed differently. For example, a galaxy like this, where a lot of the matter will go as hot gas into the halo, this hot gas in the halo will be lost for galaxy evolution, for star formation for a long time. While if you have a galactic fontaine, you can recycle the matter into the thin disk where stars forms on a much shorter time scale. And all of these are open questions. And again, the answer is not unique. Probably different galaxies with different star formation rates and different redshifts, or different stages of the cosmic evolution will be in one of these different states. So this was the introduction that to allow you to connect to the observations. I tried to have a more intelligent perception of the observations. So the observations are the word which is very key is multi-wavelengths. I think there is hardly no electromagnetic photons which doesn't carry some information about interstellar matter. This is sometimes astrophysics is divided into wavelength range for observations, but if you are really interested in ISM, you basically are interested in all the frequencies, and from low frequency radio waves all the way to gamma rays, everything carries some unique information about the ISM. And we have learned key aspects of the interstellar medium physics from all of these telescopes, which cover all the fields. Often these observations are not driven by the interstellar medium physics is not the main motivation for building the telescopes, but or making the surveys, but eventually they become useful and they are being used to understand what we do. And obviously, at each wavelength, you see a different process, which I've listed some of them here, not exhaustively. And it's obviously the fact that we are interested in such a broad range of wavelengths is related to the fact that the range of temperature is so large, from 10K molecular cloud to 10 million degree plasma. Obviously, you are going to go from radio to X-rays, but it's not only that. Some specific components like dust can be observed in X-ray, can be observed in the optical. It can also be observed in the infrared and microwave frequencies. So it's also for a given component you can have multiple perspectives at different frequencies. So I tried here to describe in a bit more detail what are the tracer, what are their strengths and limitation, and which ISM phases we target. This is, as I told you at the beginning, and the observations are not straightforward. They don't provide a comprehensive view right away, because each observation tends to sample one specific phase, one specific environment, and you need to combine many different observations to have a complete picture. This is part of the difficulty as being an ISM observer. There is it's very hard to conclude on anything with one single observation. And obviously these observations have different strengths and limitations. And some, for example, like stellar observations are really useful, for example, because I was show you get to 3D information, but they are sampled only on discrete line of sight. So, but all of them, as you can read here, have limitations. So the same for the energy tracers. As I told you, it's very important to understand the energetics. And for this, while some of the observables tend to correlate with the total amount of matter, some others really connect to the energy, and they are like kind of thermometers and calorimeters. And here I've listed them for all of the phases, and we have access to the processes, to the cooling radiation, because basically the cooling radiation occurs through photons, and those photons are those we can observe with our telescopes. And each time, of course, because it's a different phase, we probe different dissipation processes. And some of them is the cooling of the thermal energy, and for the other side, it's a dissipation of the mechanical energy, which is in turbulence. So I will start on this interstellar tour from the sun. It's really fascinating for someone who is an astronomer, and to say we are about to, or we are actually doing in situ observations. The sun happens to be in a small cloud, which is representative of a bigger set, which is in the local interstellar medium. It's a low, partially ionized, low column density, partially ionized cloud, and something which we could not see in anywhere else, in any other environment, because it will be much too faint to be observed. But it's around us, and it's probably the cloud for on which we have the more detailed information, because we are able to see interstellar dust and interstellar gas from flowing into the solar heliosphere, into the solar system, and we are able to sample directly what is out there. And more interestingly, recently, as the two Voyagers probes have crossed the magnetic shell, which protects, which isolates our interstellar solar system from interstellar medium, and are making in situ measurements, and in particular of magnetic fields and cosmic rays in the interstellar medium in this cloud. And so it's really the environment we know the best, and and it's still a problem to model this cloud. It's really we know it very well, and by knowing it very well, it raises new questions which don't have straightforward answers. And if I'm going to step out, and if you step out and you find more of this local cloud, which low column density, partially ionized gas, it's one of out of many. If you each color here represents another cloud, and those clouds now are identified through UV optical spectroscopy toward nearby stars, and we have their distances. And as I will show you, we have a 3D picture of those clouds. And there are small clouds all around us, and the origin of these clouds is not clear, because the ISM around the sun is mostly empty. It has a very low average column density. The X-ray data shows that it is filled with hot ionized medium, hot plasma at a temperature of about 1,000,000 degrees. And there are small clouds which are warm, and which have temperatures of about 8,000 degrees inside of this hot plasma. And we don't know if they form out of cooling, the cooling of the hot gas, or if they were blown in from nearby OB associations into the solar neighborhood. This is an open question. So a very new and very enthusiastic perspective on the ISM is that we are able now to give distances. I think Frédéric Mott mentioned this earlier today. This is a big contribution from Gaia. It was started before by the previous astrometric mission, stellar astrometric mission Hipparcos, but now we are able to push this much further out. And I think eventually in the future, I think the data will in the galactic plane will extend to the galactic center. And so there is an ongoing effort to build 3D pictures of the distribution of dust. So it's the color here is the amount of local reddening, and you see how it is clumpy. And I remember I mentioned to you that the sun is in empty region, and the sun here is at the center of this cross, and basically there is not much around the sun at this sensitivity level here, which of this map has the small clouds which are within this central cavity don't show up. They are much too small. They don't have enough matter, quantity of dust and matter. And so you can do this at different distances above and below the galactic plane. So we really have a 3D view today, because it's directly connected to observation. It's stellar reddening, but this 3D perspective is going to be extended to other tracers, because we will have soon access to polarization. There is also spectroscopic tracers which are being measured by Gaia, and through correlations, you can imagine that very soon we will have a 3D picture of the interstellar matter in the solar neighborhood, and possibly all the way to the galactic center. So now this is another picture which was, I think, shown by Andrea Ferrara. The latest X-ray survey by the mission Hirosita, and where you see the emission is color coded, and you see different different frequency bands, and what is most interesting locally is this red glow, which is all over the sky, which is the emission from this hot plasma, which fills the local cavity. And so this hot plasma is thought to have been produced by all supernova remnants. Some of them maybe as early, the latest one probably like about a million year ago, and and you see other example of such X-ray bubbles. Here, this is the one which is associated with the Scorpius OB association. And here you see the shell, which is associated with the Eridanus Orion association. And this is a more compact one, which is, because it's more distant, is the Vela star-forming region. And so imagine that the solar neighborhood was something like this 1 or a few million years ago. And now with this hot gas, which is here traced by the X-ray emission, is cooling. It's slowly cooling, but the space has been emptied by the explosions, and it's still mostly empty. So I mentioned that there was a warm ionized gas. The tracer here is the H alpha emission, which has been here extended spectroscopically by correlation with the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. So you take the data towards the extragalactic fields was correlated with the interstellar dust emission, and you can get a spectra of this emission. So that's the same one, and I have added here because it's another tracer of the warm ionized gas, which provides an important information. It is the scale height. It's the same gas which is here this is the recombination line, so it's proportional to the emission measure. So it's some, in a way, difficult to convert it in terms of mass, but you have a direct tracer of the column density and also the scale height, because you have the distances to the pulsar through the what we call the dispersion measure, which is which provides the electron column density along the line of sight to the distance of the pulsar. And if you do that, you realize that this warm ionized gas is distributed over a thick disk with a scale height of about 1.5 kiloparsec. And it accounts for about 20% of the mass. So the dust emission is very spectacular because it was with IRAS and later other Spitzer. I have not shown all the space missions, Spitzer and more recently Herschel and Planck. You have access to large fields, in particular with IRAS and Planck, the whole sky, and different bands and a lot of dynamic range. And you see here that the something which is related to this view, to interstellar turbulence, as the medium you see, as you look at it with higher angular resolution, is structured on all scales. And it's hard from first view to decide that this is a high angular resolution observation compared to this one. But so it has this idea. It's not exactly true, but it is self-similar, and this is one characteristic which is indicative of interstellar turbulence, and we would like to we try to characterize statistically. So if you go to another tracer here, which is the atomic hydrogen, the hyperfine structure line of H1, which was mentioned by Adam Leroy in the first talk, and you have access to one more dimension, which is the Doppler velocity, the shift of the line, which gives you a measure of the radial velocity of the gas, and you have a structure which is very similar to the one from the dust, but you have an additional information here, which comes from the gas velocity. And for the interpretation of the H1 absorption, so the emission is proportional to the Coulomb density of matter, as the emission is optically seen, and the excitation temperature is always the same. You need to have access to the background. To separate the effect of temperature and optical depth, and you need to have access to observe the H1 in absorption, and this is done by observing bright radio galaxies which have a background temperature in your telescope, which is larger than the spin temperature. When this happens, you see absorption. So whenever your background source has a temperature larger than your cloud, which you are trying to observe, you see absorption. If the cloud is warm, and so the temperature of your cloud is larger than the background source, you don't see absorption. So this is a way to disentangle the cold neutral medium and the warm neutral medium. And this is illustrated here in this diagram, where you see that this is towards this radio galaxy 3C286. You see the spectrum, which is measured in emission, looking slightly off the source. And if you look toward the source, you see that you see much narrower components in absorption. This traces the cold neutral medium, while here the broader components in dashed trace the warm neutral medium. This is, and with this, first it was how the two-phase structure of the cold neutral, the neutral medium was discovered, but it also gives you an estimate of the fraction of mass in the two. And now these observations are sensitive enough that they can also identify gas which is at intermediate temperatures, and demonstrate that it does account as anticipated of a large fraction of the mass. So in this, these observations of background sources have the limitation of being toward discrete sources. So you don't get a continuous mapping of the components, and this precludes the characterization of turbulence in the different phases. And to overcome this, there has been an effort led by Anthony Marchal and also his thesis director, Marc-Antoine Vildechêne, to develop this an approach, data analysis approach, to characterize spectroscopically the emission from H1 gas, and to use this characterization to map the different phases continuously. And this is illustrated here, where it's another field that's the one I showed in the previous slide, but from this spectral decomposition, which I will not detail because it's quite technical, you get maps of the warm neutral medium, the intermediate temperature gas, and the cold gas, and you can see that they are all structured and all intermixed, as there is basically correlation. And this decomposition allows to probe the turbulence in the warm neutral medium, and so to separate the contribution from turbulence and from thermal broadening to the line width. And so it's a very important step forward. So I've been focusing on galactic observation, but obviously I would like to say that everything is relevant to the bigger picture, because if you look at different objects, and here I have selected a few template sources in external galaxies from a massive star-forming region in the LMC 30 radius, to archetype starburst outflow, to the archetype interacting galaxies, the Antennae galaxy, and even bigger the cluster cooling flow in Perseus. You see everywhere the cold is traced by dust in red, and the hot is in blue. It is X-ray, and everywhere you see this mixture, this mixture of phases. the cold is mixed with the hot. And this is a general characteristic um, of matter, diffuse matter in space and in galaxies. You see here that the cold gas, it's those filaments is appearing within this bigger halo, which is very hot plasma at 100 million degrees. So to finish my tour, I will briefly talk about molecular clouds, and this is let's say the coldest component of the ISM, and the one which is for many the most interesting ones, because it is the one which is going to produce new stars. So as you see, and we don't have today a complete CO. This is the main tracer is the CO120 line from 12CO. This is a map which was observed over 20 years, combining observations from United States and Chile. And the observation from Chile are mostly yet incomplete, as only the galactic plane was observed. But from this, it's a paper published a few years ago by Marc-Antoine Méville-Deschênes. You can identify the clouds using a similar decomposition as the one which was being used to analyze the H1 observation. And this is what is interesting here. What I would like you to focus on is the distribution of this virial parameter, which is a ratio between the magnetic energy and the turbulent energy to the gravitational energy. And you see that this ratio is always much larger than this threshold, which is the value you expect for gravitationally bound clouds. So I think one important thing, as I told you, as the outcome of the step towards star formation is not only the formation of cold gas, you also have to dissipate turbulence to allow for gravity to take over. And you see that in most of the molecular gas in our galaxy is not gravitationally bound. It's most of the clouds which are being identified through these CO observations. This is the mean value, this is the median value, and this is the standard deviation of the distribution of values within a given mass bin. Most of this gas is unbound. So this fact, and the fact that the molecular gas is not bound, contributes to explain the very low efficiency of star formation. It's only the most massive clouds which tends to be on average bound. And in practice, only 50% of the clouds are gravitationally bound. But since the ones which are bound are the largest one, they account for a significant, much larger fraction of the total mass. And this is, and it shows that the turbulence is still very important in those clouds. As the gas has cooled thermally, but it has not yet cooled mechanically. I would like to finish the tour now with another tracer of the molecular gas, which is the molecular hydrogen, which is it is normally the tracer you would like to use, because instead of using a trace molecule, you observe the main constituent. But as you see from here, because it's a symmetric molecule, first only the delta G plus or minus 2 transitions are allowed, quadrupolar transitions are allowed, and the first transition comes from a level which is at 500 K. Since most of the molecular gas is cold, you never see emission from the bulk of the molecular gas, and you don't see any H2 emission. So it's not a tracer of mass, but it's going to be a tracer of energy. You remember I made this difference between tracers of mass and energy. This is really a very simple example where this is going to be a thermometer, because it is going to be, we are going to, with H2, to select specifically, to observe specifically as a gas which is warm, not the bulk of the gas. And so we are going to be able to observe the cooling rate of molecular clouds. And this is really what it is unique for. And this emission is observed in the galaxy, but to illustrate, because it's far more spectacular, I will show an observation of an external galaxy on which I worked a lot with. So this is because it's really a study case which illustrates what is happening. As you have a, so this object is called Stephan's Quintet. As the background is Hubble imager. You have a group of galaxies here which interact, and the interaction has brought a lot of matter into the halo, and this there is a intruder, a galaxy which is entering into the halo at very high speed. And this is a chance encounter. This galaxy is not the one which has created the tidal features here. And you see that the blue color here is not X-ray, it's molecular hydrogen emission. And you see that this is a very violent collision where you have a shock at 1,000 kilometers by second, but the radiation is being emitted, the cooling is occurring through these molecular hydrogen lines, a molecule which is destroyed very, very easily. So it shows, it's an illustration of what I alluded to at the beginning. It's the fact that there is a turbulent, there is an energy cascade. And the energy here is brought in a very violent event, but it's going to be carried on smaller scales to much milder events. And it's only at these smaller scales that the cooling is going to occur. And we don't really understand exactly how this happens, but this is what the observations are telling us. And something like this, for example, it's something that the current simulations are not going to be able to account. It involves too many scales, more than the ones which can be fit in one single simulation. And so you see that the dynamics of these are lines of ionized carbon, oxygen, and CO, and you see that the lines are very broad. So most of the kinetic energy of the collision has been transferred to the molecular gas, and the molecular gas which we see here is probably formed within the collision. So it's an interesting perspective where you see that the very violent event, which will tend to dump a lot of energy. So it is a heating event, but the heating event, because it creates a higher pressure, is going to trigger gas cooling and the subsequent formation of molecular hydrogen and probably stars. In this object, currently there are no stars being formed, but I can imagine that in the future, as the gas is going to be able to dissipate its kinetic energy, it will become a star forming environment. So this is a bit complex, but it shows you the connections between this apparently contradictory contribution of the ISM. It's both a reservoir which holds the heat, but it's also the place where the conditions are created for gas cooling and star formation. So Annie, maybe I can stop here, answer a few questions before moving forward.
Yep, no worries. Great, thanks, Francois. So we had a few questions. So I've grouped them into sort of different topics that seem to go together. So the first question was, could you just explain again the shape of the cold neutral medium, warm neutral medium equilibrium curve from Wolfire et al.? There was somebody, I think it was Anushka, was interested to know why does it have this characteristic S shape?
So I guess it's really the dependency on temperature of the cooling. The warm gas tends to be stable because it due to the contribution of the Lyman alpha cooling, and which rises very steeply as you approach 10,000 K. And the other main coolant is ionized carbon as the C2 line. And also the C2 line creates a sharp gradient of cooling rate with temperature at a temperature around 100K. So it is really the contribution from these two cooling lines, C+, the far infrared line of C+, and the Lyman alpha line of hydrogen, which create a very strong derivative of the cooling function with respect to temperature that set these two phases.
Okay.
After that, you
great.
have to write the mathematics, but this is really what it comes to.
Then we had a few questions about the impact of turbulence and magnetic fields on the ISM cooling curves. So, for instance, how are the sort of simple equations of gamma proportional to density and lambda proportional to density squared affected by the presence of turbulence of the magnetic field, particularly in the ionized ISM?
So when you do these cooling heating equilibrium calculations, one ignores dissipation of turbulent energy and dissipation of magnetic energy. So in this approach, they don't come in as the turbulence and the magnetic energy are present, but they don't come in. As the idea in a galaxy like ours is that on average, as the dominant source of heating is stellar radiation, and the magnetic and turbulent terms are at least an order of magnitude smaller. So, but this is the simple picture in reality, and what one believes that the dissipation of turbulent and magnetic energy is probably very much localized, and this is a characteristic of interstellar turbulence, which is called intermittency. So it's localized both spatially and in time, and that it is going to these two energy terms are going to create local pockets of hot gas in the interstellar medium, where these other energy terms become dominant, and this may be what we are tracing with this warm molecular gas, as the hydrogen spectroscopy I just mentioned. But obviously, this is far more complex than the big picture I drew. Again, I had to simplify a lot the reality.
Nonetheless, we have somebody that, I mean, it leads almost exactly to what you've just said. There was somebody who was interested to know quantitatively how much of the heating of the CNM WNM is due to that dissipation of turbulent energy.
So in a galaxy like the Stephan's quintet, this is dominant. This is why I decided to show this as an example, because the stellar, there are very few, the star formation rate, present star formation rate is very low. We are in the galactic halo, so the contribution from stellar photons to the energy budget is very small, and we are completely dominated by almost 2 orders of magnitude and by the dissipation of turbulent energy. But this is a very specific circumstance in a galaxy evolution where you had like a giant interaction with a collider at very high speed. This is a very rare event. Very nice for to understand the physics and as an experiment, but it's not characteristic of galaxies in general. In general, one is completely dominated by in the energy budget, and one is completely dominated by the stellar heating processes, and it's very hard to convince yourself to isolate the contribution from the mechanical energy dissipation and magnetic energy dissipation. It is really something we would like to do, because those are important channels, because you don't only need to cool the thermal energy, you need also to cool in terms of mechanical energy. And this is what I showed with the molecular gas. And the molecular gas is still turbulent because it has not yet dissipated its turbulent energy. And as long as it doesn't dissipate this turbulent energy, gravity cannot take over to form stars. So it's very important to follow the path of this turbulent energy and magnetic energy, it's in the observation is difficult to do in most galaxies.
Okay.
Because it's not dominant on average.
Okay. I have one more question about energy flows. And we've got another couple of questions, but I might keep them to the end because I'm aware that it's already 2:45. So the question we had about the energy flows was, how much does the transfer of kinetic energy to magnetic energy via shocks depend on sort of the nature of the existing field and like how that field arose in the first place?
Yeah, that's a long. It's introduced my next the next session. Maybe I will answer this in the next slide.
Okay, great.
So maybe I can restart, or unless.
Yeah, I think let's restart, and I'll keep the other questions I had in reserve.
I'm a bit late in what I planned, but maybe
okay.
I don't know. I will not speak about this. Maybe if we'll see.
Okay, go ahead.
But let's address this question about magnetic field because it's an important one. So far I have mostly ignored magnetic fields, and it's what astronomers tend to do most of the time, most of them. But obviously we know they are there, and we know that they are dynamically important. But they are not straightforward to observe, and it's not straightforward to understand what they do. So the question about the origin of the magnetic field, it's really answered in my title here. The magnetic fields are basically, we don't know exactly how, but they are an outcome of cosmic evolution. And they are there because of cosmic evolution, and at the same time, as often it's a byproduct of cosmic evolution, but it's also an actor and a tracer. The actor we don't know really well, and the tracer right now it's not very much used because it's quite difficult to have access to magnetic field through observations. But I expect this to become more important in the future. We will use magnetic field as tracer of cosmic evolution, and the answer is of why is there magnetic field to start with. So you need some primordial magnetic field, but this can be very weak. And there are many possible origins, and some relate them to cosmology and to the very early universe as the Big Bang, and some come from the early steps in galaxy formation. But at the end, you need some process where you create some primordial magnetic field, and once you have that, and the physics tells you that it's going to become an energy reservoir which will tend to balance with the others. So the magnetic field is connected to the gas motions, and so there will be we will sooner or later approach an equipartition, a rough equipartition between magnetic energy and turbulent energy. So as energy is being released by galaxy formation, star formation, part of it is going to go into turbulence and in magnetic energy, and this is done through dynamos. And people distinguish two types of dynamos. One which is the mean field is the coupling of the turbulence on the larger scales, on the scales of superbubbles, and with the differential rotation of the galaxy, and that is able to create coherent magnetic fields over the full size of a galaxy. And you have the turbulent dynamo, which is a cascade from the injection energy of turbulence, let's say the size of super bubbles, to smaller scales. And at the end, what we observe is that in a galaxy which has evolved like us, where all of these dynamos are supposed to have saturated, we have reached a maximal amplification. The magnetic energy and the turbulent energy of the gas are comparable. So in a way, it's in a galaxy like ours, it's simple. We have reached saturation, and you are about in equipartition. And the question of in the ISM today, basically, people say maybe we can ignore magnetic fields, but in practice, this doesn't make sense to me. The magnetic fields are there, and the B fields, they shape turbulence. And the turbulence is not the same it will not be the same if there was no B field. And at the same time, there is the feedback, and turbulence generates B field. So basically, these two are completely interwoven. As the gas dynamics is completely connected both ways to magnetic fields. And it's not like in a physics experiment where you could have a control sample without magnetic fields. There is no such thing as a galaxy without magnetic fields, where you could say, I'm going to compare the two objects and decide what is the impact of magnetic fields. It doesn't make sense to consider that magnetic fields don't exist, and such objects do not happen. So this is a picture on Earth from iron needles to illustrate two important aspects of magnetic fields. First, in this picture, if you there is a magnetic field, but if I don't put the needles, you don't see the magnetic field. So it's this aspect that it is a hidden agent. It can be there, but not noticeable. You need some kind of tracer process which is sensitive to magnetic fields. And what you see here is that magnetic fields, they create coherent structures. Now, this is really illustrated here. The needles are not random. Because there is a magnetic field, they create this regular ordered pattern. And this is something which happens in interstellar space. So the observational perspective on magnetic fields actually are many. There are always difficult observations to make, because they involve observing polarized light, and to observe polarization, you need to make differences between two big signals to measure something which is small. So you need very good sensitivity, you need very good calibration, you need very good understanding of your telescope. And once you have all of that, you can have meaningful polarization measurements. Obviously, it was not the first thing one would like to do often, because it requires much more careful work than regular observations. But I think we have come to a point where it is really one of the dimensions of the observations which needs to become a first priority, because it's very much unexplored. And this is really happening. And there are a lot of current and future telescopes which we provide on all of these tracers of magnetic fields and some information. So what you see here also is that it's like everything else in astrophysics. Each tracer samples a specific environment in the ISM, and each of them gives you a different information. Faraday rotation and Zeeman splitting gives you a direct measurement of rather direct of the strength, because here it depends on electron density. Here it depends on electron density of the strength of magnetic field. This is for synchrotron. You can get also access to the strength of magnetic field if you assume some equipartition with the cosmic ray energy. While for dust polarization, you get only the topology, the structure of the orientation of the field. It's geometry, not its strength. So the big question about ISM dynamics is these three players. There are three players. You have gravity, and you understand that this is what's going to lead to star formation, and you have turbulence, which tend to oppose magnetic field. But there is another force which opposes gravity. It's magnetic fields. And what we see, and if you look at the diffuse ASM, which I had described, and those two are the dominant terms, they are comparable as they exchange rather rapidly energy, as they are comparable, but they dominate this one. So the big question, and has been identified for a long time, is how you locally get this one to win over the two. And this is an unsolved problem. So why is it so? Because this ratio between the mass, and so the gravitational energy is proportional to the mass, while the magnetic force is proportional to the flux. this is unobservable, so I will show some observation. But as long as this as the flux remains frozen, the magnetic field remains frozen in matter, and this mass to flux ratio doesn't vary. And you see that this ratio is proportional to this mass to flux ratio is related to the ratio between these two energy terms. So basically, the problem is that we know that in the diffuse ISM, this is lambda is small, and it's as long as the field remains frozen in matter, it's going as illustrated here. The matter is going to condense, but the magnetic field is going to remain the same, and the ratio doesn't change. So there are ways out of this. There is theoretically, there are several ways you can circumvent this problem. As first, the matter can condense instead of condensing isotropically. It can condense along the field lines, and then you contribute to gather matter and to enhance the gravitational binding energy without increasing the magnetic flux. So you may be able to gravity may in this context be able to win over magnetic energy. But there are other possibilities which have been suggested and quantified. One term is the ambipolar diffusion, which is to stay simple. The magnetic field is tied to the ions, and the ions can separate dynamically from the neutrals because only the ions are being sensitive to the magnetic force, and so slowly they can diffuse and away, and the ions will carry magnetic field out. This is a very slow process unless you are on a very obscured region where the ionization fraction becomes quite small. The other idea which has been suggested more recently, which is, but it's still difficult to prove observationally, is that you will be able to dissipate locally magnetic energy by magnetic reconnection, and this may be happening very often in the interstellar medium. This is very interesting possibility, but it's hard to demonstrate it. So so the observations, as I told you to start with, are not really answering those big questions, but it's interesting to show a few observations and what we are finding. So recently, there have been progress in measuring dust polarization in external galaxies, thanks to SOFIA. And this is a recent paper which shows the polarization pattern. As the lines here show the direction of magnetic field in the overlaid on an optical picture of the galaxy M51, and here you see the same picture but from synchrotron polarization. So I'm going to focus on the dust, because it is really to the dust. We have a tracer of the matter, so it's the dust data is more directly suited to investigate this interplay between matter and magnetic fields. And it brings me to one of the topics I worked with a lot on over the last decade or so. It is observations which were made by the Planck satellite, and this is a whole sky map of the galaxy, dust polarization, where you have in colors the dust total intensity, so it traces the distribution of matter, and the texture is the magnetic field orientation. And it was the first statistical perspective on the correlation of matter and magnetic fields, which we obtained at much higher, again, resolution than what we could do with external galaxies. And one interesting feature I'm highlighting here is that we find a definitive correlation between matter and magnetic fields, which is I think shows that the magnetic field is dynamically important in organizing the matter. Here you see that if you look at the very diffuse ISM and structures where the magnetic and turbulent energy are much larger than gravity, and you see that the matter tends to be aligned systematically with the magnetic field. And this is a signature of diffuse matter. And while if you go to clouds which form stars, for which gravity has been able to take over, you realize that one observes that the magnetic field tends to be perpendicular to the structures of the clouds, which is well illustrated here. And this is understood possibly as the fact that the magnetic field is dominant through the process at which accretion occurs, matter condensation occurs, and so it tends to occur along the field lines and produce those structures which are perpendicular to field lines. So if you go to the ISM, now this is the topology, and if you go to Zeeman observations, and this is Zeeman observation with respect to column density, and going from diffuse interstellar matter to molecular cores, and you see this is an observational proof of what I just said at the beginning. And in the diffuse ISM, this ratio is subcritical, and so the magnetic energy dominates gravity by far. If you are in molecular cloud envelopes, you tend to be in the middle, and somehow you for these molecular cores, they tend to be supercritical. So these cores which are gravitationally bound, it seems that the gravitational energy has overcome magnetic support. What is interesting is to connect again the multi-phase observation is that there is another mean to measure the magnetic field strength is Faraday rotation, and this is a value of the magnetic field component along the line of sight derived in direction towards pulsars and with known distances from the ratio of the rotation measure, which is proportional to this quantity, and the dispersion measure toward the pulsar, which is proportional to the electron column density. And so this provides an estimate of the magnetic field along the line of sight. And you see here that first two important things is that and this traces regions where there are a significant number of electrons, so it has to be warm neutral medium and warm ionized medium. And you see that the magnetic field strength in those inferred from the modeling of this data is a few microgauss, and this is very similar to the value which are inferred for the cold neutral medium from Zeeman observation. So one sees that the condensation from the warm phase to the cold phase doesn't provide an enhancement of the magnetic field, which shows that the thermal pressure of the gas is small compared to the magnetic field. It's another observational proof that the magnetic field is dynamically important. The gas basically structure itself with respect to the magnetic field, and not randomly. This is message here. So I think, Annie, I think I don't have time for the dust. It doesn't matter. I think it was a lot.
I think we might have a dusty coffee, maybe.
Yeah. Maybe I can go to my last slide right away. I let you read this as I may be a bit biased because I have been working on ISM for a long time, but it's really a fascinating field. It is transverse to astrophysics. It connects to galactic evolution, formation, and it's key to understand cosmic evolution. I hope I have been able to convey this, and the school in general will convey this fascination for interstellar medium physics. The biggest challenge, as I repeat, is to understand how it works as a whole. One may be lost in understanding details, and one has to always look for the big picture. And the comparison with simulation is key in this, because there is no way we can give sense to the observations otherwise. And obviously, the telescopes have become very, very powerful, and as Andrea Ferrara yesterday was showing, we have detailed observations of the interstellar matter in very distant galaxies. But the local view remains very important, because this is really where you have access to the small scale structure, the detailed processes, and this interplay between gas dynamics and microphysics. And this is what I have presented to you. So my very last slide is, because it's Bastille Day, I should not have been working today, but hopefully I will go and see the firework tonight. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Francois. That's really fantastic. So we've got quite a lot of questions in Slack. And unfortunately, we won't have time for them all, but I thought maybe I'd start with the ones related to the magnetic field. So we had Noah who asked whether the result that in the diffuse ISM, the turbulent and magnetic energies are roughly equal, and they're both much greater than the energy in gravity. Does that comparison of the different energy terms hold generally for galaxies, or is that specific to the Milky Way or to the local neighborhood?
I think observationally we don't know, because such measurements as the ones I showed you are very difficult to make. These Zeeman measurements, it took 20 or 30 years to gather them. Each one is a major undertaking, and they are not easily extended to distant galaxies. And so I think but I expect that on the scale where we form stars, this will be true in general, but it's probably not true on the scales where galaxy forms. When galaxy forms, obviously gravity is more important than magnetic fields. The magnetic energy builds up as galaxy forms. The kinetic energy, which is released by infall and into turbulence by feedback, is channeled through magnetic fields. So the magnetic fields are probably very weak to start with, and they build up with time. And the galaxy formation also, because it occurs in dark matter halos, it's probably dominated by gravity. So the answer to the question depends on the scale one is interested to study.
Then we had a question about your beautiful slide of M51. I like this question because it's something I've asked myself a few times as well. Liana said that she was amazed that the synchrotron polarization follows perfectly like galactic large-scale spiral. Is that what we expect from spiral density wave theory? And like, how does that happen, that the synchrotron polarization, which has such a large scale height compared to the matter in the disk, still seems to follow the spiral arm so well?
I think this is a question that I don't know the answer really. When you work out the equations of the mean field dynamo, it's a bit like the spiral density waves, and the natural solutions are spirals. But in practice, my understanding is that those spirals have are not directly related physically to the ones of stars or gas, to the gravitational potential. They are similar modes, but they are not related. And I think in reality, I don't know this field very well, but I think the pitch angles of the spirals is not the same, and the magnetic, for example, the magnetic field strength is tend to be larger in the interarm rather than in the arms. So I think it's the giving impression. I think the there are similarities, but it's not a directly physical connection, and it's not we are not observing exactly the same. But I am careful about this answer because it's not. I don't know really the details. Maybe Annie, you know more than me.
No, I think you've summarized my thoughts on the matter as well. Then there was a question from Aaron. So you showed a picture of Taurus where the dust polarization suggests that it's basically asking, we have dense molecular clouds where the dust polarization seems to follow the structure of the gas very well, and then others where it looks perpendicular. So he's wondering, is there a general case? Is there a particular sort of set of column densities or densities where we expect perpendicular versus parallel fields, or are we sort of observing exceptional cases locally?
No, I think it's very well. It's a result which now has been confirmed by additional observations, and it's quite well defined. The threshold in column density for this change of orientation is about 10 to the 22 hydrogen per square centimeter, and it corresponds more or less to the column density in molecular clouds you need for structures to be gravitationally bound. So I think this is a well-established result, and it's something which has been discussed by theoreticians and is on the way to be well understood. I think it shows that the dynamic field controls the formation of clouds, of gravitationally bound clouds. And the alignment, I think it's something you expect just from interstellar turbulence. And when the interplay between turbulence and magnetic field without gravity, you expect alignment between magnetic field and gas structures. It's a characteristic of interstellar turbulence.
Okay. And then last question, and that was a question that was early on, but it was about mapping out the 3D structure of the field and sort of what are the prospects for actually understanding the magnetic, like putting together a three-dimensional picture of the field.
So so Gaia has provided us parallaxes to, I think, 10 billion stars. So eventually, it will be about 10 billion stars with accurate parallaxes across the galaxy. And the missing step is to measure stellar polarization towards the stars. But there are projects. There are already some surveys which have started to do that. And in particular, there is a survey of the galactic plane in polarization, which has contributed some of that. And there is a project to extend this to the high latitude. And often, so the data some of data exists, some data will be collected in the next few years, and obviously it takes time. The mathematics and the tools to do this efficiently and to build a 3D map for polarization, for magnetic field out of this polarization, stellar polarization data, is still underway. It needs to be developed. But I don't think there is a strong stopper, a strong problem to do that. It's going to take a few years, but it's going to happen very soon.
Okay. Well, I think with that, I'd like to thank you again, Francois, for the very fascinating lecture.